Goblin Tales of Lancashire by James Bowker. The Enchanted Fisherman. There are few views in the north of England more beautiful than that which is seen from Morecambe, as the spectator looks over the beautiful bay with its crescent coastline of nearly 50 miles in extent. At low water the dazzling sands, streaked by silvery deceptive channels, stretch to the distant glimmering sea, the music of whose heavings comes but faintly on the gentle breeze. But at tide time a magnificent expanse of rolling waves sweeps away to Peel, and is dotted over with red-sailed fishing boats and coasters. Far to the north the huge heather-covered Furness Fells stand sentinel-like over the waters, and above them, dimly seen through the faint blue haze, tower the grand mountains of the magic lake country. The scene is full of a sweet, dreamlike beauty, but there are times when the beautiful is swallowed in the majestic, as the mists come creeping over the sea, obscuring the coast and hiding everything save the white caps of the waves gleaming in the darkness, through which the muttering diapasons of the wind, as though in deep distress, sound mysteriously. Or when, in winter, the moon is hidden by scudding clouds, and the huge rollers, driven before the breeze, dash themselves to death, as upon the blast comes the solemn boom of a signal gun, and the faint cries of those in danger on the deep. Years ago, however, before the little village of Poulton changed its name and began to dream of becoming a watering place, with terraces and hotels, instead of the picturesque tumble-down huts of the fishermen, against which, from time immemorial, the spray had been dashed by the salt breezes, the only people who gazed upon the lovely prospect were, with the exception of an occasional traveller, the families of the toilers of the sea and the rough-looking men themselves. These hardy fellows, accustomed to a wild life, and whose days from childhood had been spent on or by the sea, loved the deep with as much tenderness as a strong man feels towards a weak and wayward maiden, for they were familiar with its every mood, with the soothing wash of its wavelets when the sunbeams kissed the foam bells as they died on the white sands, and with the noise of the thunder of the breakers chased up the beach by the roaring gales. One evening a number of these men were seated in the cosy kitchen of the John o' Gaunt, listening to Howard England as he narrated some of his strange experiences. "A mine," said he, "when I was nobbut a bit of a lad, Tom Grisdale being drowned, and now as we're talking about the dangers of the songs, you'll maybe hearken to the tale. Poor Tom was the best cockler in Bank, and as used to the sounds as a child is to the face of its mother. But for all that, he were drowned on 'em after all. I can call to mind yet, for young as I were old enough to think a bit when out quare happened, and the sight of the dead bodies the next day were with me day and night furlong afterward. The day when Tom and his missus and the two lasses set out to see some relations on missus' side as lived in Furness country yon. Thowd Mon and the Dowters in Chandry, and the missus riding upon the colt at the side. It were a greatly bonny afternoon at back end of the year. The day as they should have come back were very misty, and about thedja dark, just as here and there a leap were beginning to twinkle in the windows, and the stars to peep out. The noise of a cart coming crunching o'er the beach took me fayther to the door. 'Why, yon's how Tom Grimsdale's cart back again,' he cried out, and he darted out to the door and me after as fast as I could. A crowd of folk and childer soon gathered round, wondering what were up, but now could be larnt, for though the lasses is set out as bright and bonny as posies Gillivers with their Enchanted, they were too frightened and dazed, and too waked with the wheat and cowed, to say a word. One thing, however, was sure enough, thou folk hadn't come back, and although the tide then had covered their track, and was shining in the moonlight, where the mist could be seen through, just as if it hadn't money S-Bank Mon's life to answer for, a lot of young cocklers were for starting off there and then in search on 'em. Thou and more experienced, however, wouldn't hear on it. 2 lives in one day were quite enough, they said, so they all waited till Theb, and then started. Me, Lilas I were, among rest, for me feyther were to taken up in talking to send me home. It were a sad outing, but it were lively compared with coming back, for when we turned toward S-Bank, the strongest of the lads carried out Tom and his missus, for we hadn't gotten far o'er the sands afore we found the poor old lass, and not far off in deep channel, out Tom himself. They were buried in Thou churchyard, and one of the lasses were laid aside on 'em, the fright having been too much for her. When t'other sister recovered a bit and could bide to talk about it, who said as they get lost in mist, and thou mum left him in Chandry, while he walked a bit to find channel. When he didn't come back, they get frightened, but t'owd woman wouldn't stir from the spot till they heard twatters come in, and then they went a bit fur, but could find nowt of Tom, though they thought now and then they could hear him shouting to 'em. The shouts, however, get fainter and fainter, and at last stopped altogether. Giving themselves up for lost, they left the reins to the mare and took Cow. The poor old lass were quite dazed at the absence of Tom, and as the Cow was swimming across the channel, who lost her owd, and were carried away. The lasses knew nowt no more, the wench always said, till the folk run down to cart upon beach. Her as were left, who were always queer after, and who used to walk along to bay at all hours, just at the tide time, you know, and it were pitiful to hear her, when the wind were a bit shriller than usual, saying as who could hear her old feyther's voice as he shouted when he'd wandered from, and couldn't find way to him through the mist, who afterwards went to service at Lancaster, to a place as the parson fund for her, in th' idea of the change doing her good, but it weren't long afore the news come as who were in th' asylum, and heard as who died there some time after. No sooner had the grey-headed old fisherman finished his story than one of the auditors said, "Who met well fancy who heard the voice of her feyther, for mony a neat and mony another have I heard that cry mysen. Ye may stare, but there's more sounds to be heard in the bay nor some of you lads know on, and I'm no child to be frightened of being in dark. Why, no but the night afore last, I heard a peal of bells ringing under water." There was a moment of surprise, for Roger Heathcote was not a likely man to be a victim to his own fancies, or to be influenced by the superstitions which clung to his fellows. Like the rest of his companions, he had spent the greatest portion of his life away from land, and either because he possessed keener powers of observation than they, or loved nature more, and therefore watched her more closely, he had gradually added to his store of knowledge, until he had become the recognised authority on all matters connected with the dangerous calling by which the menfolk of the little colony earned daily bread for their families. As he was by no means addicted to yarns, looks of wonder came over the faces of the listeners, and in deference to the wishes of old England, who pressed him as to what he had heard and seen, Roger narrated the adventure embodied in this story. The fisherman's little boat was dancing lightly on the rippling waters of the bay. The night was perfectly calm, the moon shining faintly through a thin mist which rested on the face of the deep. It was nearly midnight, and Roger was thinking of making for home, when he heard the sweet sounds of a peal of bells. Not without astonishment, he endeavoured to ascertain from what quarter the noises came, and, strange and unlikely as it seemed, it appeared that the chimes rang up through the water, upon which, with dreamy motion, his boat was gliding. Bending over the side of the skiff, he again heard, with singular distinctness, the music of the bells pealing in weird beauty. For some time he remained in this attitude, intently listening to the magical music, and when he arose, the mist had cleared off, and the moon was throwing her lovely light upon the waters and over the distant fells. Instead, however, of beholding a coast with every inch of which he was acquainted, Roger gazed upon a district of which he knew nothing. There were mountains, but they were not those whose rugged outlines were so vividly impressed upon his memory. There was a beach, but it was not the one where his little cottage stood, with its light in the window and its background of wind-bent trees. The estuary into which his boat was gliding was not that of the Kent, with its ash and oak-covered crags. Everything seemed unreal, even the streaming moonlight having an unusual whiteness, and Roger rapidly hoisted his little sails, but they only flapped idly against the mast, as the boat, in obedience to an invisible and unknown agency, drifted along the mysterious-looking river. As the fisherman gazed in helpless wonder, gradually the water narrowed, and in a short time a cove was gained, the boat grating upon the gleaming sand. Roger at once jumped upon the bank, and no sooner had he done so than a number of little figures clad in green ran towards him from beneath a clump of trees, the foremost of them singing, "To the home of elf and fay, to the land of nodding flowers, to the land of every day, where all things own the fay queen's powers, mortal, come away." And the remainder dancing in circles on the grass and joining in the refrain, "To the home of elf and fay, to the land of every day, mortal, come away." The song finished, the little fellow who had taken the solo tripped daintily to Roger, and with a mock bow grasped one of the fingers of the fisherman's hand, and stepped away as though anxious to lead him from the water. Assuming that he had come upon a colony of greenies, and feeling assured that such tiny beings could not injure him, even if anxious to do so, Roger walked on with his conductor, the band dancing in a progressive circle in front of them, until a wood was reached, when the dancers broke up the ring and advanced in single file between the trees. The light grew more and more dim, and when the cavalcade reached the entrance to a cavern, Roger could hardly discern the greenies. Clinging to the little hand of his guide, however, the undaunted fisherman entered the cave and groped his way down a flight of mossy steps. Suddenly he found himself in a beautiful glade in which hundreds of little figures, closely resembling his escort, and wearing dainty red caps, were disporting themselves and singing. "Moonbeams kissing odorous bowers, light our home amid the flowers, while our beauteous king and queen watch us dance on rings of green, rings of green, rings of green, dance, dance, dance on rings of green." No sooner had the fisherman entered the glade than the whole party crowded round him, but as they did so a strain of enchanting music was heard, and the little beings hopped away again and whirled round in a fantastic waltz. Roger himself was so powerfully influenced by the melody that he flung himself into the midst of the dancers, who welcomed him with musical cries, and he capered about until sheer fatigue forced him to seek to rest upon a flowery bank. Here, after watching for a while the graceful gambols of the greenies, and soothed by the weird music, the sensuous odours, and the dreamy light, he fell into a deep sleep. When he awoke from his slumbers, the fairies had vanished, and the fisherman felt very hungry. No sooner, however, had he wished for something to eat, than on the ground before him there appeared a goodly array of delicacies, of which, without more ado, Roger partook. "I'm in luck's way here," he said to himself. "It's not every day of the week I see a full table like this. I should like to know where I am, though." As the wish passed his lips, he saw before him a beautiful little being who said in a sweet low voice, "In the land of nodding flowers, where all things own the fay queen's powers." The fisherman no sooner saw the exquisite face of the dainty greenie than he forgot altogether the rosy-cheeked wife at home, and fell hopelessly over head and ears in love with the sweet vision. Gazing into her beautiful eyes, he blurted out, "I don't care where it is if you are there." With a smile the queen, for it was indeed the queen, seated herself at his side. "Dost thou, mortal, bow to my power?" asked she. "Aye, indeed, do I to the forgetfulness of everything but thy bonny face," answered Roger, upon which the queen burst into a hearty fit of laughter, so musical, however, that for the life of him the fisherman could not feel angry with her. "If the king were to hear thee talking thus, thou wouldst pay dearly for thy presumption," said the fay, as she rose and tripped away to the shadow of the trees. The enraptured Roger endeavoured to overtake her before she reached the oaks, but without success, and though he wandered through the wood for hours, he did not again catch a glimpse of her. He gained an appetite by the freak, however, and no sooner had he wished for food again than dishes of rich viands appeared before him. "I wish I could get money at this rate," said the fisherman, and the words had hardly left his lips when piles of gold ranged themselves within his reach. Roger rapidly filled his pockets with the glittering coins, and even took the shoes off from his feet and filled them also, and then slung them round his neck by the strings. "Now, if I could but get to my boat," thought he, "my fortune would be made," and accordingly he began to make his way in what he believed to be the direction of the river. He had not proceeded very far, however, when he emerged upon an open space surrounded by tall foxgloves, in all the beautiful bells of which dreamy-eyed little beings were swinging lazily as the quiet zephyr rocked their perfumed dwellings. Some of the greenies were quite baby fairies, not so large as Roger's hand, but none of them seemed alarmed at the presence of a mortal. A score of larger ones were hard at work upon the sward, stitching together moth and butterfly wings for a cloak for their queen, who, seated upon a mushroom, was smiling approvingly as she witnessed the industry of her subjects. Roger felt a sudden pang as he observed her, for, although he was glad once more to behold the marvellous beauty of her face, he was jealous of a dainty dwarf in a burnished suit of beetles' wing cases, and with a fantastic peaked cap in which a red feather was coquettishly stuck. For this personage he suspected was the king, and forgetting his desire to escape with the gold, and at once yielding to his feelings, he flung himself on the luxuriant grass near the little being whose weird loveliness had thrown so strange a glamour over him, and without any thought or fear as to the consequences, he at once bent himself and kissed one of her dainty sandalled feet. No sooner had he performed this rash act of devotion The numberless blows fell upon him from all sides, but he was unable to see any of the beings by whom he was struck. Instinctively the fisherman flung his huge fists about wildly, but without hitting any of the invisible greenies, whose tantalizing blows continued to fall upon him. At length, however, wearying of the fruitless contest, he roared out, "I wish I were safe in my boat in the bay," and almost instantaneously he found himself in the little skiff which was stranded high and dry upon the Poulton beach. The shoes, which he had so recently filled with glittering pieces of gold and suspended round his neck, were again upon his feet. His pockets were as empty as they were when he had put out to sea some hours before, and somewhat dubious and very disgusted, in a few minutes he had crept off to bed. When the strange tale of the fisherman's wonderful adventure with the hill folk was ended, the unbelievers did not hesitate to insinuate that Roger had not been out in the bay at all, and that the land of nodding flowers might be found by anyone who stayed as long and chalked up as large a score at the John o' Gaunt as he had done on the night when he heard the submerged bells and had so unusual a catch. Others, however, being less sceptical, many were the little boats that afterwards went on unsuccessful voyages in search of the mysterious estuary and the colony of greenies. And a year afterwards, when a sudden gale swept over the restless face of the deep and cast Roger's boat bottom upwards upon the sandy beach, many believed that the fisherman had again found the land of Everday.